So what we're going to do now is attempt to give a little bit of interactivity into our components on this page. When we're hovering over the image, for example, then we want to sort of zoom into the image and lower the opacity so it feels a bit more interactive. So what we'll do is we'll go to the CSS for our member card. So we'll open up the member card component, CSS. And inside here, what we're going to be targeting is the card. So we want to add a card, .card, and we want to target the hover element of this. So when we're hovering over the card. And what we'll do is we'll add a CSS transform, and we want to scale this, and we're going to set it to 1.2 and 1.2. And this will just make the image bigger. So it'll look like we're sort of zooming in. Then we'll give a transition duration, and we'll set this to 500 milliseconds, and we want the transition timing function to ease out in this case. And what we'll also do here is add opacity and set it to 0.7 so that it sort of appears to fade out slightly as well. And then we'll target the card image, and inside here we're going to use exactly the same classes, but what we're going to do is return the image to its normal size. So we'll say 1.0. And if we take a look at our progress, then what we should find, and as we hover over the images, we can see that they sort of fade out slightly and get larger. But what we don't want them to do is overflow into the other components. So what we can use is that card image wrapper that we created earlier inside our member card. We use this card image wrapper, so we can target this and prevent our image from going outside of this div. And what we can do is go back to our CSS class and target the card image wrapper, and we can set its overflow to hidden. And if we go back, take a look, and we hover over these, now the images are contained inside that div. Pretty cool. But what I want to do here, whilst we're talking about CSS, is mention the CSS encapsulation that we have with Angular. And if I right click and inspect this page, and let's just inspect an individual element, an image, then what we see inside here for the classes, we have an ng content blah 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 for each of these classes. So Angular is adding something on to each of these classes, and this represents the component that we're inside of. So this means we're inside, or inside here, we're inside our app member card, and these ng content applies to anything inside this class. And what this effectively means, if I used or I wanted to style a card component that I had in a different component, then those styles that I just created there would not apply. And that's down to Angular's CSS encapsulation. So if I go back to the member card component, so when it comes to CSS, what we could do inside our component here is specify the encapsulation policy. And if I just start typing encapsulation, we're only going to take a look at a description of this. We're not actually going to change anything inside our app here. But there's different options. And the first one's deprecated, so we're not going to mention that because it uses, or the other option is the shadow DOM instead. The browsers now have an equivalent of what Angular does here, but it does it natively in the browser, and you would need to specify that in the code, I believe, to use the shadow DOM for this. We're not going to touch that inside this course. What we're using is view encapsulation emulated, and this is Angular's version of using a shadow DOM. It basically gives our CSS some encapsulation so that what we write inside our CSS file doesn't infect any other parts of our CSS or classes in our application. Because CSS stands for cascading style sheets, it's designed to be set at a global level and then cascades down to all of the elements that share the same class. Now, our behavior in Angular is not to use that policy and not to cascade, but to encapsulate the styles inside a component. So we use this encapsulation emulated by default. If we didn't want that behavior, then we would set this to view encapsulation of none. And that would allow us to use global CSS without any encapsulation here. So in order to target a class inside our component, if we wanted to use a global style sheet to do that, then we would need to set this encapsulation to none, as we wouldn't be able to target elements inside our components if we're using view encapsulation emulated. There is a caveat to this though. If it's not supplied, the value is taken from compiler options. The default is emulated. If the policy is set to encapsulation emulated and the component has no styles or style URLs specified, then we automatically use view encapsulation none. But we do have a style sheet here, so if we wanted to override this, then we would need to set our encapsulation to none. This is just a brief mention of this. We're not really going to be using any of that in here. We're going to stick with the defaults, and when we need to style a component, we'll typically just use the component's style sheet to do so, and that way each component is its own self-contained thing, where we don't need to worry about any styles being overridden at a global level. So now we have a small bit of styling. What we're going to take a look at next is adding some animated buttons onto these to further style our member cards.